We are following breaking news. The husband of the American woman who seemingly vanished in the Bahamas has reportedly been arrested. He says that she fell overboard during a boat ride in choppy waters, but clearly investigators think there is more to this story. This is a breaking news edition of On the Case presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Joining us now to talk more about this case, Michael Winkleman, maritime attorney. Always great to have you on Law and Crime when we're following some of these cases out of the Caribbean. Brian Hooker's story. They're on this dinghy and they're in some less than ideal conditions. And he says Lynette falls off, the keys go with her, and then he has to paddle back to shore. How plausible, just knowing the water and the cases you work, I mean, how plausible is that story that he's giving at this point?
Not very. I mean, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt because I don't want to cast blame on people before there's been due process. But from my view, there's definitely a lot of holes in the story. I mean, really, it's one of two things, Chris. It's either a terrible accident or it's a terrible crime. So it's not like there's a million theories that can be going around there. If we set aside the chance that it's a crime and it's just an accident, these are experienced mariners. They would have been aware of the sea conditions. Why would you hop on your dinghy to go for a ride to try to get to shore? Maybe it could have been because the conditions were rough. But if you're really an experienced mariner, you're not going to keep yourself in that position unless it came out of nowhere, unless it was an unknown storm system. But from what I've seen with a little bit of research was that, there was a known cold front coming through. More often than not, with cold fronts, what comes through first is some heavy storms. So there's definitely holes there, Chris.
Because I think of the conditions, 18 to 20 knot winds, which for those who aren't boaters, we're talking like 20 to 25 mile per hour wind gusts. I mean, to be on and you look back at their YouTube, they put out a lot, and you can see like they know what they're doing. I mean, they've done some serious trips. Like, how surprising is it that someone would go out in a dinghy in those type of conditions?
Yeah, exactly. Very surprising, unless they were trying to avoid a storm. That would be plausible to me, that maybe they were trying to hit land, so that's why they were trying to do that. But if that were the case, again, you would have thought they would have left way earlier.
Yeah, and going out at 7:30 at night, it's dark. There's just part of it. It doesn't seem like the type of thing, people who regularly practice safety, which it appears they do, that they would go with. At the same time, how likely is it that we'll find Lynette Hooker's body? I know that local authorities have said this is more a recovery mission at this point. It's been a couple of days. She went overboard off of this dinghy, according to Brian, at night. I mean, what kind of happens here in that part of the investigation?
So the statistics show that if you're not found within the first 24 hours, your chances of survival are infinitesimally small. I mean, and even to me, I think there's more holes in the story from Brian about her going overboard, him not being able to get to her. I know if my wife were in the water, I mean, there should have been life jackets on the vessel. I mean, I would be doing everything I could, and I would most likely put myself in the water to go and rescue my wife. So just more holes from my perspective.
Like at this point, if you're the Bahamian authorities and you're trying to figure out what happened, you don't have a body to this point. All of this happened in the middle of the night. He doesn't have the keys to the vessel. He says that he paddles back to shore to Marsh Harbor. I mean, how do you go about this investigation to try and, find out whether his story is actually the truth?
Yeah, so I mean, that's basically crime investigation 101. Of course, I'm always on the civil side. When people get hurt, I represent them in civil cases. But at the end of the day, the investigation isn't that difficult in what I would do versus what criminal authorities would do. But you're going to have a limited data set. I mean, the main thing is going to be Brian's story, and are they buying it? If they had an opportunity to check his blood alcohol levels to see whether or not he was intoxicated. But what was the reason they were going there? Were they going there to avoid bad weather, or were they going there to go to a bar? I mean, I'm a native Miamian. I spent plenty of time in the Bahamas and the Caribbean, and there's lots of fun bars on land in the Bahamas. The daughters commented that they were drinkers and that there was some volatility in the relationship. You would, of course, want to do an interview with the daughter as well. I know the FBI is involved. So I think between the Royal Bahamian authorities and the FBI, they're going to have some data to sift through. And the question is it going to be enough to actually charge Brian with a crime? Or when all the data is sifted through, do people determine that it was an accident?
And the stepdaughter, I mean, she has gone scorched earth in these interviews in terms of the allegations she's making. I mean, being very public and saying that allegedly this relationship was not as perfect as it looked on social media, that there was a history of domestic violence, in her words. She made allegations about them drinking, and just volatility in the relationship. How much does that factor in? And if you know the Bahamian authorities, how they go about it, because she said, at least in the Fox News interview that she did, that she called the Bahamian authorities and she couldn't really get through. And apparently she has a lawyer. How much can that actually factor into trying to figure out in that moment how Lynette Hooker goes overboard?
I think it played considerable weight. I think her name was Carly, and Carly's clearly coming out and telling a very strong narrative about a very rocky relationship, about people that were big drinkers, that they had a volatile relationship. And those are definitely factors that any investigating authority would look into and give significant weight, just to really put together the pieces of the puzzle.
And it seems like, the other part of it too is she said that Brian sounded monotone and calm when he called her with the news. And like, on one hand, I don't know how I would respond, making that phone call if it was me. At the same time, this is someone who paddled a heck of a long way, apparently, back to shore, because he didn't have keys to the engine after she went overboard. And he releases this statement on Facebook. And Facebook's a real casual way to release a statement as opposed to going through like a law firm. But it read to me like a lawyer wrote this. I don't know what his background is, but he thanked every single, department that's a part of this, saying, my family appreciates it. It just came off to me as professionally written, not saying that that's a bad thing. But what stood out to you in the statement that he made?
I completely agree, Chris. Having read the statement, it was very short. It was very terse. It didn't really have a lot of emotion behind it. If you wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, he's in a state of shock and maybe someone wrote it on his behalf. But it did feel very generic, sort of what ChatGPT would tell you to write in that kind of a situation. And the fact that he was cold and monotone when telling the story, again, benefit of the doubt says, yeah, he's in a state of shock. But in my experience, and I deal with grieving families all the time, people who've been through terrible, terrible traumas. That's not the response that I generally see. The response that I generally see is tremendous grief, tremendous overwhelm, tremendous sadness, tremendous tears. And that not being there, does that raise red flags? Certainly. But again, to be clear, I do think Brian should be entitled to due process. I think we should get to the bottom of it. Of course, you and I are just giving our opinions. But yes, I do think there's a lot of red flags that shows something problematic here.
What do you just think of? I just think of what it must have been like if his story is true. You think of this woman you called the love of your life going overboard, and you're trying to get to her and you can't because the current is pushing you away, and then you have to paddle ashore. It sounds terrifying and incredibly sad if that's what happened. Certainly it's sad either way. If you were his attorney, what type of advice does an attorney give him at this point? He's in a foreign country. It's not just a case where your wife went overboard anymore, because you have a stepdaughter who is making some very serious allegations that's turned the heat up on you as this investigation's ongoing. Like, what's typically the advice that you would give someone in his situation?
Well, that's a tricky question for me, Chris, because I'm on the civil side. So I'm
Right.
usually prosecuting the case, pushing forward the case. So with criminal defense attorneys, their analysis is very different. They don't want them to get charged. Brian may have admitted to him that he did it, but then he can't necessarily divulge that. Having said that, let's assume it really was an accident and I was he was my client. I would want to put him on television to tell the story about what happened, because in today's world, narrative shifts so quickly. So if you're trying to not necessarily control the narrative, but if you're trying to get the truth out, get the truth out. Sit down with you, talk to Chris and say, hey, look, this is what happened. This is why it happened. Yeah, I was in a state of shock at first, and this is the love of my life. I wish I had gone in after her, but put it out there. So to me, when you doing that versus putting out these cold and sort of terse statements, again, more red flags.
It certainly is. And we did reach out to him, and
I figured you did.
He's welcome to come on, and we would love to hear his side of the story, even though we know it's an incredibly tough time with what he's alleging took place. Is he likely at this point, like with how the Bahamian authorities in some of these cases, and I know you're on the civil side, like, is he free to go? I mean, he hasn't been charged, but in terms of, the Bahamians, as the search is ongoing, if he wanted to head back to the United States, would he be free to do that?
So what I've seen in real time is that there have been no charges that have been filed. I know the Bahamian authorities would often say something like, look, we don't want you to leave the island. Practically speaking, legally speaking, could he leave the island? Yes. If they wanted to, could they prevent him from getting on a plane or a boat? Sure. But given the fact that he has not been charged, I do think he's free to leave the country.
And you wonder, I mean, if he does have a lawyer, someone advising him, like if he was to leave at this point, what type of message would that send, even if he is, completely innocent and this was a terrible, terrible accident? How are the Bahamians when it comes to these types of searches and some of these cases that play out? It's obviously a huge tourist destination, a lot of boaters, not just people like the Hookers, but I used to live in South Florida. It'd be very easy to just run a boat over, to like the west end of the Bahamas. How are the Bahamians when it comes to cases like this?
I think they're great. I mean, in my experience, and I've dealt with them dozens and dozens of times, they're very passionate people. They want to get to the bottom of situations. They're often working in concert with the FBI, and they're very good at their job, particularly the Royal Bahamas Maritime Agency. I mean, they are terrific at investigating accidents. Sometimes people think maybe they're in bed with the cruise lines. Obviously, this is not a cruise ship case, but because the cruise industry puts so much time and effort and money into the region, but I can't say that to be the truth. So in my view, I think they're terrific. I think they're going to get to the bottom of it. There's a limited data set that's available to them, but let's see what they're able to come up with.
And when it comes to the U.S. State Department, the FBI, I know they put out, the State Department put out a statement saying that they're cooperating with authorities. Clearly, this is a Bahamian case, and to your point, they're really good at this, and they have a lot of experience in a lot of these cases. But like, what does that assistance actually look like when the State Department or the FBI says that they're helping out?
Well, so, I mean, yes, it happened in the Bahamas, so it's a Bahamas case, but it happened to a U.S. citizen. Therefore, FBI has jurisdiction and can have as much or as little involvement as they want. Obviously, the FBI has a heck of a lot on their plate. So with Lynette going missing, that's not necessarily the top thing on their radar. So I think in the FBI's view, if there's adequate resources that are put to it, then they're going to rely on that. Often in situations of missing persons, Coast Guard gets involved immediately. They'll set up a grid area. They'll conduct an entire search and investigation, or as here they call a recovery mission. I don't know the extent of the Coast Guard's efforts, but they are unbelievably good at locating bodies. So I hope to a certain extent they've been involved in the rescue operations.
Yeah, and you think of that at this point too, in a lot of these cases, it just bodies are not found, and, we did have that case out of Barcelona recently with a U.S. college student who ended up passing away, and his body did come up ashore. I think back to Sudisha Kananki, who is the American college student in the Dominican Republic, and her body did not come back to shore after, something that happened during spring break. In these cases, what makes it so difficult when you look at the waterway and the area around where Brian is alleging all of this took place? Just why is it so challenging for a recovery to actually happen?
Well, it's finding a needle in a haystack. I mean, you've got winds, you've got ocean currents, you've got whether or not the body took on water and sunk immediately. So you've got a million variables. But the biggest part of it is there's just such a huge geographic area, and every minute that goes by expands that area. So as great as the Coast Guard is, they are fighting an unbelievably uphill battle to try to find that needle in a haystack.
This might put you on the spot as well, but for Carly, the stepdaughter, and I know she said that she had an attorney in that Fox News interview, like what role would an attorney be playing for her at this point? Clearly, this is her biological mom, also her stepdad, who's been in her life for a long time, and I know it doesn't seem like they have the best of relationship, but what is the role of an attorney for someone like her in a situation like this as this search is going on?
Well, I think if she did hire counsel, the counsel would be able to try to get involved in the investigation as much as possible. Really not doing that much that would be different than what Carly can do, but picking up the phone, calling the authorities. Theoretically, if she wanted to file a case, a civil case, she could then have subpoena power to be able to get more information. She could do a deposition of him to try to get more questions. So there's a lot that an attorney could do. It's probably a little bit early for that. But yeah, a civil attorney could do a lot to further the investigation. Not necessarily in the short term, but more in the long term. As an example, if it's 6 months from now and there's still more questions than answered, she could certainly file suit. She could certainly have an attorney sit down and take his own deposition, which is basically a question and answer session, to try to get more information, as well as getting any kind of records, seeing was there any kind of a life insurance policy that he had taken out on the wife. Was there any type of life insurance payment that was made? So definitely a civil attorney could dig a little bit deeper into the investigation.
Yeah, and that's a good point on the financials. We don't really know. I mean, they're retired at this point. They certainly do a lot of traveling and own this sailboat. How long does a search like this go for? I know we're at the recovery point. Saturday night is when this allegedly took place, and now we're talking on Wednesday.
I would be surprised if it was still underway. In my experience, you've got a good 24 to 48 hour window. I've definitely seen it go up to more like 72 hours. But now when we're this far out, I'm sure it's winding down.
Yeah, and a lot of questions still at this point. Michael Winkleman, maritime attorney. Always great to have your expertise here on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to see you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also now streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.